Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
So early in the week, the Prime Minister warned that leaving the EU could precipitate armed conflict in Europe. Today, Boris Johnson hits back, comparing the European Union to Hitler in an interview with the Sunday Telegraph. This is what he said. Napoleon, Hitler, various people tried this out. He means by that unifying Europe, and it ends tragically. The EU is an attempt to do this by different methods. Boris then goes on to say the euro has become a means by which superior German productivity is able to gain an absolutely unbeatable advantage over the whole Eurozone. So there we are. Could I begin by saying, could we organise a self-denying ordinance that British politicians should just shut up about Hitler?
It's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because the Leave campaign are already getting quite grumpy, saying, well, look, he wasn't really talking about Hitler. This is a terrible stitch-up by the other side to kind of bring him... But it is a kind of magic, or the opposite of a magic word, really. And Boris is too clever a politician not to know that if you mention Napoleon and Hitler, people are going to write headlines on that. He's a columnist, he knows this. And it's just this bizarre situation. I kind of keep... it's Sadiq Khan sitting at home thinking, I'm the only London mayor so far who hasn't mentioned Hitler this year. Someone should go and check in and see if he's got any thoughts on the matter, really.
That's a good point. He's the only London mayor that hasn't. Interesting today's coverage, though. It's suddenly become very personal. It's all about Boris Johnson. It's about David Cameron's relationship with Boris Johnson. It's about whether George Osborne's got a hope now of ever becoming Conservative leader.
Well, I think that newspapers have always liked to make things personal. It sells more papers than the issue. We have a saying in newspapers which is things are worthy but dull if they're too issues-led. So it doesn't surprise me in the slightest that it's becoming more personal as the clock ticks towards the key date. I think on Boris Johnson's comments, clearly absolutely agree with Helen that no good can come of a politician mentioning Hitler. But the reaction to Boris Johnson's remarks has been rather hysterical, if anyone actually bothers reading the context of it.
Well, we gave the context there.
It was actually a perfectly reasonable statement of historical fact, unwise politically, but I don't think we should get to a situation where nobody can mention anything historical about Hitler or Nazi Germany without it creating a ridiculous hysterical overreaction.
I completely agree with you, but I don't even think it will be unwise politically if it helps him win votes. Boris is casting himself. He wrote a book about Winston Churchill. He fancies himself as an inherited to Churchill. Churchill beat Hitler, so it's useful to Boris to sort of evoke Hitler. It was completely reasonable, the point that he made. In fact, Andrew, in your days editing the Sunday Times, if the copy had come in and you've seen the word Hitler, you think we might be able to get a front page headline out of this. Actually, he made a completely reasonable point, which is that ever since the collapse of the Roman Empire, there have been repeated and several attempts to unify Europe, from the Habsburgs to the Ottomans to Bismarck, Napoleon, and actually, in a way, the EU and Angela Merkel has got a area of German hegemony which is closer to what Bismarck wanted than ever before.
Amal, have you ever heard the words, by different means, stretched harder? There's a slight difference between having endless, incredibly boring bureaucratic committees and rolling tanks into Poland. By different means does a lot of work.
Of course it does, but it's true that if Boris is making the argument that the EU is an attempt to unify Europe, and that history has seen it's a catchy idea historically to try and bring together people that he would say are very, very different. I agree it's a bit of a stretch. I think he did it quite
a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, I think it's a but I think the comparison is reasonable. I also think there's a real danger, Andrew.
In what way is the European Union comparable to Hitler's attempt to shackle
people who support Brexit
Europe
would say that the European Union is an attempt to create an economic and legal superstructure without a political and civic and linguistic base.
Of democratic nations.
And that it's a
forgive me, I missed that bit in Hitler's plan.
Yeah, but it's completely reasonable, Andrew, and you know this, so it's so nice to come on shows like this and talk about it. It's completely reasonable for people to evoke historical figures in making important arguments about historical trends. Okay. And actually, Hitler was a throwaway remark. So was Napoleon. Napoleon wasn't in the headlines. He's not as evocative.
It wasn't a throwaway remark. It was in the quote as we gave it.
It was one of several people that he mentioned. And actually, Boris' argument is reasonable.
Who was the other? He only mentioned Napoleon.
Okay, he mentioned Napoleon, and maybe he should have mentioned the Habsburgs, and maybe he should have mentioned Bismarck.
All right.
And maybe it's a slightly flagrant thing to do, but it's actually a completely reasonable argument.
What do you make of what's now being briefed out from, and I think it's from Andrew Cooper, the pollster in this for the government, that, the polls show neck and neck, but actually we're so far ahead in the economic argument that it's just like the election last year. We're ahead in the economic argument, and that's why we'll win. The neck-and-neck bit is not the important thing.
Well, they've always hoped that. I mean, the evidence is that people generally put the economy as the highest concern. What the Out campaign is trying to do, and we've seen a bit of this from Nigel Farage on some of the other political shows this morning, is to make the point that this decision is not just about GDP. This is not just about a few extra pounds in your pocket. There is a much broader question here, and the Out campaign will be hoping to highlight the question of what does this mean for our culture? What does it mean for society? This is not just about whether you're going to be a couple of quid better or worse off.
Okay.